This is the 14th Dalai Lama. He was born as Tenzin Gyatso in 1935 to a farming family in eastern Tibet. And today he's probably the most recognizable Buddhist figure on the planet. And now he's approaching a big milestone, his 90th birthday on July 6, 2025. It's a big deal because he's indicated that on or around his birthday he will announce a succession plan for who will be the next Dalai Lama. So how will that decision even be made? We've already made a whole video explaining what the Dalai Lama actually is, what the title means, and how each one is chosen, so I'll drop a link to that if you want to check it out. But the short version is, the title of Dalai Lama has been around since 1578, and it plays a really important role in Tibetan Buddhism. Tibetans believe that each Dalai Lama is an emanation of the Bodhisattva Chenrezig, who you might know by his Sanskrit name Avalokiteshvara. He's considered the Bodhisattva of compassion and the spiritual protector of the Tibetan people. For most of the history of the Dalai Lamas, they were both the political and religious leader of the Tibetan people and ruled from the Potala Palace in Lhasa. The office of Dalai Lama is passed through a reincarnation lineage, so after a Dalai Lama dies, a search is conducted for a child that might be the next Dalai Lama. The search process is pretty complicated. It involves consulting oracles, sacred lakes, performing tests on the child, and so on. But the institution of the Dalai Lama has reached a critical crossroad. How we got to this point is a long and very complicated story. Tibet has always had a powerful neighbor, China, and the two have been clashing over borders and influence for more than 1,000 years. The exact history is disputed, but we can start in 1949 when the Chinese Communist Party emerged victorious in the Chinese Civil War and established the People's Republic of China. The CCP declared their intention to reclaim territories that they thought were rightfully part of the Chinese motherland. This included Tibet, and in 1950 the Red Army invaded eastern Tibet, and by 1951 the militarily weak Tibetans were forced to sign a 17-point agreement accepting PRC control. The 14th Dalai Lama was a teenager when all this was happening. At first, he was relatively open to integration into the PRC. The 17-point agreement promised that Tibetans would still have political autonomy and religious freedom. And initially, the Dalai Lama was hopeful that this would end up being a good thing for the people of Tibet. And he even agreed with some of the critiques the CCP made about economic and social reform. But things fell apart in the 1950s. Tensions between China and Tibet kept escalating, and in 1959, after a failed uprising, the Dalai Lama fled to India. He ended up in the town of Dharamsala, where he set up the Tibetan government in exile, a political and religious base that's still active to this day. And that's more or less where things have stood ever since. The Dalai Lama has continued to push for greater autonomy for Tibet, but he's also become something of an international symbol for Buddhism, peace, and nonviolence. But the Chinese government sees him as a splittist, someone who wants to split the Tibetans from the People's Republic of China. Because of this, he's a politically sensitive figure. He's not allowed to visit his homeland, and even owning a photograph of the Dalai Lama is not allowed for Tibetans. The CCP has also tried to assimilate Tibetans into broader Chinese culture. This includes policies like offering financial incentives for Han Chinese to move into Tibetan regions, promoting Chinese language instruction in schools, and sending Tibetan children to boarding schools away from their families. But perhaps the move getting the most international attention has been the Chinese government's attempt to control the process of finding reincarnated lamas. China's claim to have a say in the selection of Tibetan lamas is not new. It goes all the way back to 1793, when the Qing dynasty introduced something called the Golden Urn, a kind of lottery system used to select high-ranking reincarnations. At the time, the Qing dynasty held what's called suzerainty over Tibet. Now, historians debate what that looked like in practice, but basically suzerainty means a situation where a powerful state controls the foreign policy and relations of a less powerful state, but still allows the less powerful state internal autonomy. The Qing court was concerned about dysfunction in the selection process for the Dalai Lama, and so they instituted the Golden Urn as a way to reduce corruption. The names of 5 candidates would be written down on slips of paper and placed into the Golden Urn. Then one name would be drawn at random, and whoever was picked became the officially sanctioned incarnation. The Golden Urn system was used off and on until the Qing dynasty fell in 1912, and Tibet declared its independence. For example, the 10th, 11th, and 12th Dalai Lamas were chosen using the Golden Urn, but the 9th, 13th, and 14th were not. Now, if you're curious about how the Chinese government frames all this, there's a Chinese state media video that lays it out. It claims the Golden Urn was introduced by the Qing to cut down on corruption and keep the process under central control in Beijing. The video claims that although the 14th Dalai Lama was exempted from the lottery, his recognition still required central government approval. Of course, the Tibetan exile community and many outside analysts dispute this narrative. They point out that the Golden Urn was not consistently used, despite official claims, and it was only applied sporadically, often alongside more traditional methods of recognizing a reincarnated Lama. The scholar John Powers argues in some cases the urn was used more to appease Qing officials than to determine the outcome. Critics also question whether authority over something like the Dalai Lama's succession can be really passed down from the Qing dynasty to the Republic of China to today's Communist Party, 3 entirely different governments with very different relationships to Tibet. And that brings us to today. With the Dalai Lama turning 90 this summer, a major geopolitical power struggle is looming over the succession. The CCP has developed plans to, in their view, regain their rightful control over the reincarnation and selection process. In 2007, China made a regulation that required all reincarnations to receive government approval and required government permission to form search committees, effectively rendering unauthorized reincarnations illegal. The law declares the selection of reincarnates must preserve national unity and solidarity of all ethnic groups, and the selection process cannot be influenced by any group or individual from outside the country. The CCP knows that this is not just about religion. They consider the Dalai Lama to be a rallying point for Tibetan independence and for international support for Tibetan independence, which the CCP considers a threat to Chinese sovereignty. Protests and riots have broken out at multiple points in Tibetan areas. These protests often flare up in March, a month that marks the anniversary of the 1959 uprising when the Dalai Lama fled into exile. Major protests broke out in March of 1989 and again in March of 2008. The 2008 protests were especially high profile because they coincided with the Beijing Olympics. Tibetans hoped that the global spotlight might help draw attention to their cause. In both cases, Tibetans were protesting economic discrimination, restrictions on religious freedom, and government policies that were encouraging Han Chinese migration into Tibetan areas. So what would it actually look like if the CCP chooses the next Dalai Lama? Well, we actually have a pretty good idea. The case of the Panchen Lama, who's traditionally considered the second highest ranking Lama in Tibetan Buddhism. In 1989, the 10th Panchen Lama passed away. Then in 1995, the Tibetan government in exile announced that they had identified his reincarnation, a young boy named Gedon Chokyi. Soon after, the Chinese government took the boy into custody, and he's never been seen since. The Chinese government insists that he's happily living a normal, anonymous life and simply doesn't want to be bothered, but many Tibetans and international observers consider him the longest-serving political prisoner. In his place, the CCP declared their own Panchen Lama, Gyenkei Norbu, chosen using the golden urn. His education and public image have been carefully managed by Beijing, and many see him as a proxy for the Chinese government. China's state media refers to him as the highest-ranking figure in Tibetan Buddhism, a clear attempt to position him above the Dalai Lama. He's been given political appointments, regularly meets with top CCP officials, and is often photographed visiting high-profile infrastructure projects in Tibet. The Tibetan government in exile is concerned that a similar story will play out for the Dalai Lama's succession, and have made their own statements about his succession plan. First, the Dalai Lama has separated himself from political power. Now, historically and in the early years in exile, the Dalai Lama was considered both the religious and political ruler of the Tibetan people. But the Tibetan government in exile has since adopted a democratic constitution, and in 2011, the Dalai Lama formally renounced his political role, delegating that to a democratically elected president known as a Sikyong. Also in 2011, the Dalai Lama issued a formal declaration that denied the CCP any legitimacy in determining his successor, and insisted that it be done by traditional Tibetan methods. And over the years since then, he's made several suggestions about what could happen, including that an adult successor could be named instead of a child, that the next Dalai Lama could be a woman, or that he may not take a reincarnation at all. All of these would be major departures from history and tradition, but as the Dalai Lama has said, the main purpose of the appearance of a reincarnation is to continue the predecessor's unfinished work to serve Dharma and beings, and he has argued that this can take many forms. He has also said that in 2025, when he turns 90, he will establish a more detailed plan. Ahead of his 90th birthday, the Dalai Lama recently released a book called Voice for the Voiceless, Over 7 Decades of Struggle with China for My Land and My People. In the book, he declares that he'll be reborn in a free country rather than in any territory under Chinese control. He writes, "If I die as a refugee and the Tibetan situation remains like this, then logically my reincarnation will appear in a free country." In other words, the next Dalai Lama will not appear in Tibet at all. He could be born in the Tibetan refugee community in India or in another part of the Tibetan diaspora. And that would not be without precedent. 2 previous Dalai Lamas, the 4th and the 6th, were actually born outside of what is now called the Tibetan Autonomous Region. So there is historical backing for the idea that the next Dalai Lama doesn't need to come from inside Chinese-controlled territory. The international community is starting to pay more attention to all of this. In 2020, the US passed the Tibet Policy and Support Act, which made it official US policy that the succession of Tibetan Buddhist leaders, including the Dalai Lama, should be left entirely to Tibetan Buddhists, with no government interference. Under this law, any Chinese officials who attempt to name a future Dalai Lama would face sanctions. The European Union and several individual nations, including Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany, have made similar statements affirming that the succession must follow Tibetan Buddhist traditions without Chinese interference. That said, how much any of this international support will actually matter is still an open question. Even countries that have official policies supporting Tibetan rights are constantly weighing those values against their economic ties with China. And as China's global influence continues to grow, many governments may hesitate to take any bold steps that could damage that relationship. In the US, as of writing this video in June 2025, there's a lot of uncertainty around US-China relations under the new Trump administration. The CCP has also started to pressure other countries such as Mongolia, which has the world's largest population of Tibetan Buddhists outside of Tibet. In 2016, Chinese officials attempted to interfere with the Dalai Lama's recognition of the 10th Jetsun Dampa, Mongolia's spiritual leader. The Chinese government canceled a $4.2 billion loan to Mongolia when authorities allowed the Dalai Lama to visit. Other countries such as Nepal, Sri Lanka, and South Africa have also all been pressured to avoid allowing visits by the Dalai Lama. Even Buddhist leaders from other countries have been pressured to recognize the CCP's chosen candidate rather than to follow the Dalai Lama's lead. So, as the current Dalai Lama approaches his 90th birthday, questions remain about what he will announce. Analysts widely expect two rival Dalai Lamas to emerge, one backed by the Chinese government and one recognized by the Tibetan government in exile. But what that would actually look like on the ground for Tibetan Buddhists is still to be seen. The scholar of Buddhism John Powers doubts that a party-appointed Dalai Lama will hold much influence. He points to the case of the current Panchen Lama, installed by the Chinese government, whom many Tibetans regard not as a true religious leader but a state official with little spiritual authority. Powers argues that a future Dalai Lama raised in exile would receive training from respected Tibetan monastics and likely become an internationally recognized Buddhist figure, while his counterpart in Tibet would be trained in a government-run school and serve primarily as a political proxy. But of course, it's hard to say exactly how all of this will play out. Religion and geopolitics are anything but predictable. The succession process itself could introduce years, and possibly decades, of instability. Under traditional procedures, the search for a new Dalai Lama begins only after the current one dies. Once identified, the reincarnation is still a child and will require years, if not decades, of training before assuming any leadership role. That's a long window in which the CCP may seek to consolidate control, and in which the Tibetan exile community, already under strain, could face a crisis of continuity. The Dalai Lama has hinted he may try to preempt this vacuum by naming his successor before his death, possibly even selecting an adult from among the Tibetan diaspora. But Beijing is prepared with its own plans. Meanwhile, the US government has cut funding to organizations such as Radio Free Asia and Voice of America Tibet, which have been major sources of reporting on Tibetan affairs for Tibetan audiences outside of China. Several of the sources cited in this video come from RFA or VOA reporting, and their defunding may affect future coverage of Tibetan issues. Global reporting often is slanted when it comes to Tibet. That's why I use today's sponsor, Ground News, a website and app that lets you compare how different news outlets report the same story across the political spectrum and around the world. Ground News aggregates thousands of articles every day and gives each story a quick visual breakdown of their political bias, factuality, and ownership of the sources reporting it. For example, check out this story. On June 15th, President Trump announced plans to expand deportations in major American cities like LA, Chicago, and New York. Pull this story up on Ground News and you'll immediately see over 300 sources have covered this story. Scroll down and you see the political breakdown of that coverage, with the majority coming from centrist sources. Scroll down even more and you see the ownership of these sources, whether they're independent, owned by wealthy individuals, or media conglomerates. You can also compare their headlines. On the right, Fox News draws attention to the size of the cities. Trump directs ICE to expand deportation efforts in America's largest cities. On the left, the sources tend to draw attention to the fact that these cities are largely run by politicians from the Democratic Party. The LA Times reads, Trump orders ICE to expand deportations in Democratic-run cities. You should also check out the Ground News Blind Spot feed, which highlights stories largely ignored by either the left or the right. If you'd like to give Ground News a try, Ground News is giving viewers 40% off their Vantage plan. Go to ground.news/religion for breakfast or click the link in the description below to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.